I can tell you that the story I get to tell, and I'm privileged to be able to tell it, is a great, rollicking political thriller with women as the central characters. Women as activists, as savvy politicians, as lawyers, not women as assistants or helpmates or footnotes. Women are the center of this story. And it's a tale of suspense and double crosses and dubious motives and betrayal. And if I've done my job, you'll forget that you know how it turns out. It's really a book about political power and political will. It's about racial and gender politics. It's about states' rights, about the vote, and about democracy. And fundamentally, it is a book about the law. It's about the laws that we, as a nation of laws, have created to govern us, and what it takes to change the law when those laws no longer reflect modern life or modern thought. So it's what changing the law is what the suffragists worked for 7 decades, changing the law of the land at both the federal and the state level. So this is the story of the 19th Amendment, the largest extension of the franchise in our nation's history, giving the vote to half of the citizens of the United States who were not granted the vote in the original Constitution when our founding fathers developed their so-called government by the people. It was only by certain people. And the women citizens of the newly formed republic were not just forgotten, they were purposefully left out, given no voice in their government or in this great experiment of government by the people. They were denied the most fundamental right of a democracy, the vote. So this is a story of how American women's demand for the vote, which was once considered radical, crazy, subversive, impossible, was slowly and methodically and at great cost transformed into constitutional law. And so it's really how change is made in a democracy, something we're thinking about a lot these days, and in society. Because the 19th Amendment was not just a legal change. It was not just a constitutional change. It didn't just change election law. It didn't just double the national electorate. It didn't just make women full citizens for the very first time. It marked a societal change, a cultural shift in the rights and the role of women in society. And that's what made it so controversial and so difficult. And of course, we know that change is still ongoing. The fight for women's suffrage is one of the defining civil rights struggles in our nation's history. And it's one that cuts to the heart of what democracy means. Who gets to participate? Who has a voice? When we say we the people, do we really mean everyone? And of course, we are asking those same questions right now. My book chronicles the explosive climax of that civil rights struggle during one hot summer in 1920 in Nashville, Tennessee. Now, for those of you who are citizens of the District of Columbia, sorry. Then, as now, you had no representation in Congress and no state legislature. So you had no say in the ratification and adoption of the 19th Amendment. Now, for those of you who live in Virginia and Maryland, let's just say that our states were on the wrong side of history. We'll talk about that. Now, most people, myself included, before I started this project, only have a very fuzzy idea of how American women won the right to vote. And that active verb is very important. Women were not given the vote. They were not granted the vote. They had to fight for it fiercely and over decades to finally secure their natural right. And the fuzzy image that I had, and you may share, but you are lawyers, so maybe you had a better idea. But if you look at most textbooks, it will say something like, in 1848, American women demanded the vote at the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention in upstate New York. And in 1920, they were given the vote. That's really how it's portrayed. It's the march of progress. It's the evolution of ideas. It's an idea whose time has come. No, that's not how it happened. It required 3 generations of fearless activists working over 7 decades to secure the right to vote for American women. And the culmination of that crusade comes down to one fierce 6-week battle in Nashville, Tennessee. In the summer of 1920, one last state was needed to ratify the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, giving the right to vote to all women in every state, in every election, for the first time. 35 states had ratified, and 36, or 3/4 of the 48 states then in the Union, were required for full ratification. Tennessee, it turned out, could be that 36th state. And here's a contemporary cartoon showing Uncle Sam trying to button up that last button. And a woman whose bodice, as you can see, is actually in the shape of the US. And she's saying, Samuel, it's that last button. And they were having a great deal of trouble getting the last button through the spring and summer of 1920. There were only rejections of the 19th Amendment. If the Tennessee legislature approved the 19th Amendment, it would become the law of the land in time for the fall 1920 presidential election. And this was a pivotal election. The nation was coming out of World War I. It was making very important decisions about its direction in the modern world. It was making big decisions about immigration. There were labor strikes. There were race riots. There was enormous problems that the nation was going to have to face, including whether it was going to be isolationist or whether it was going to be a leader of the world. All these decisions were coming to the fore in this election, and women wanted to be part of it. But if the amendment failed in Tennessee, the suffragists feared that it might not be enacted anytime soon, and perhaps not at all. And they were right to fear this, because they saw the nation swinging in a more reactionary phase. Coming out of a progressive movement, it was becoming more conservative. And they knew if they did not get it now, with the pressure of a presidential election coming, they may not see it in their lifetime. And they were correct. The nation would swing much more conservatively. 1920s were politically conservative. We think of the flappers, but in fact, politically it was. And they were right. And of course, those of us who have watched the Equal Rights Amendment, which was introduced into Congress in 1923, know that a constitutional amendment can get very close. We hope it'll be even closer soon, but very close, and not make it over the finish line. And so they were right to really worry about that. So the enfranchisement of half of the citizens of the United States was at stake, and it all came down to Tennessee. Now, by 1920, the suffragists had been fighting for the vote for 72 years. Ever since the first public demand, of course, women have been talking about this among themselves for a long time, but the first public demand was made at that Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention in 1848 by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about Elizabeth Stanton, because she's portrayed as this kind of icy foremother, and we don't know much about her. She's really a fascinating character. She was the daughter of a judge, and she becomes the movement's founding legal philosopher. She grew up steeped in the language and the concepts of the law, and as a girl, she used to sit in the back of her father's courtroom and listen as the local citizens would come to him for advice. And she was very upset to notice that a lot of women came for his advice about abusive husbands, about financial hardships, about the danger of losing their children if they tried to divorce. And she watched her father shake his head and tell distraught women in his chambers, "No, I'm sorry, I cannot help you. As a woman, you have virtually no rights under the law. And the law does not protect you." And indeed, at this time in early 19th century, mid-19th century America, a woman, especially a married woman, had very few legal rights. The laws of coverture ruled her. She could not own property or control her own money. Everything she had belonged to her husband. Her children also belonged to the father. She had no custodial rights. She could not attend college or professional school. Most occupations were closed to her. We're talking now in the 1830s. A woman could not bring civil suit in a court of law. She could not testify in a court of law. And of course, she could not be judged by a jury of her peers because she could not serve on a jury. And of course, she couldn't vote. So young Elizabeth was really upset by her father's reaction and the fact that he said that there were no laws to protect her. So she planned a remedy. And her remedy was that she was going to take her scissors and cut out those sections of her father's law books that had discriminatory sections about women's rights, or didn't include women in these rights. And Judge Cady got wind of his daughter's surgical solution, and he intervened saying, "Elizabeth, that's just not going to work. That's not how, it's not going to help anything. You'll just have to grow up and change the law." And he must have thought that was a really safe parental advice to give to his headstrong daughter. And he had no idea that she was actually going to devote her life to doing that. So at the Seneca Falls rights meeting, she did introduce something called Resolution Number 9. And I encourage you to read the Declaration of Sentiments and the resolutions. They're incredibly modern. She not only asked for the right to vote and the right for educational equity and financial equality, but she also asks for equal pay for equal work. 1848, yeah. But she presented this demand for the franchise. And most of the other, almost all of the other participants at Seneca Falls, even though they were really activists and reformers, thought this was a bad idea. This was crazy. This was too radical. It was asking too much. It was going too far. They actually asked her to remove that resolution from the agenda, and she refused. But there was a young man in the audience who had driven his buggy 50 miles from his home in Rochester to attend the conference. And he stood up. And it was a young Frederick Douglass, just 30 years old, just 10 years out of slavery. And he stood up and he said, "No, you must demand the vote. It will never be given to you, just as it will never be given to me. And it will never be given to us unless we fight for it. You must demand this, and you must continue to demand it." And he called himself a woman's rights man for the rest of his life, and he truly, truly was. He's one of the great heroes of the story. And he didn't show up at Seneca Falls by coincidence. He was invited there by Elizabeth Stanton because they had worked together for years already. Most of the women we know as the foremothers of the movement begin their political careers as abolition workers. Susan Anthony, Elizabeth Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Lucy Stone, all start as abolition workers. And so they worked with Douglass for years before. And they all believed that at the end of the Civil War, all the disenfranchised classes, black men, black women, white women, will be given the vote. And they are sorely and bitterly disappointed when Congress says, no, America can't take two big reforms at once. They'll have to choose. And it's a terrible choice. And Frederick Douglass has to say to his colleagues, the women suffragists, the woman's hour has not arrived. For us, it is a matter of life and death, as horrible violence erupted across the country in the Reconstruction years. We need this for our very lives. Sojourner Truth was horrified by the idea that Black women would not be given the vote. She said, I am subjugated twice over. So this is a terrible split then ensues because Stanton and Anthony refused to support the 15th Amendment because it does not include women. And Elizabeth Stanton says, if that word male is put into, it was actually, that's in the 14th Amendment, if that word male is inserted into the Constitution where it never was before, it'll take us 100 years to get it out. She was almost right. It took over 50 years to get it out. But race becomes a contentious issue in the movement from the beginning to the end. And it's one of the, in some ways surprising, in some ways important parts of the story that we have to learn. So in the years since that meeting at Seneca Falls, tens of thousands of dedicated suffragists had waged over 900 state, local, and national campaigns to win the vote. They traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to do as Susan Anthony described it, organize, educate, and agitate in small towns and big cities across the nation. And you see they begin in horse and buggy at the beginning of the movement, the mid-19th century. And here's another little buggy. And by the end of the movement, you see they are working from cars. They had to travel because they had to change hearts and minds about women's role in society. They knew that before you can change the law, you have to change attitudes. And that's something that's been proven again and again. And it really was a stupendous feat of organization when you think about it. In the mid-19th century, when this begins, passenger train travel is in its infancy and very rudimentary and very difficult. There's no transcontinental railroad yet. The telegraph has just been invented. There's no telephone. There's no typewriter. They're doing it by hand and by foot and by horse. And even in 1920, when my book takes place, radio is not in use yet. And in fact, a young publishing assistant in my publishing house read a draft of the manuscript, and she came into my editor and she said, wow, I just don't believe these women could organize like this without Facebook. But they did. They held meetings and they held rallies and they marched, which was not considered proper for women to do. Here's a wonderful, the program cover for the first National Women's Suffrage Parade here in Washington in November of 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. When he arrived at Union Station, supposedly he said, where is everyone? No one's here to greet me. And they said, they're all at the suffrage parade. And there were 8,000 marchers, and there were teacher brigades and nurses brigades and floats and marching bands. And then they were attacked by men and boys. And there were pictures of this in the Library of Congress. They were attacked, their banners were ripped, they were thrown off their floats, they were physically assaulted, the police stood by, no one was arrested. It became quite a sensation, the newspapers reported it, there were hearings in Congress, the police chief resigned, but otherwise no one was punished. And this becomes the first of the big demonstrations. Now, it's really, let me see some other pictures of them marching. They didn't wear pink pussy hats, but they did wear white dresses with yellow sashes. That was their marching uniform. So when you see women wearing white, and that could be either in a women's rights march, or it could be when Geraldine Ferraro accepted the vice presidential nomination, when Hillary Clinton accepted the presidential nomination, when women in Congress were wearing white at the State of the Union. It's in honor of the suffragists. That was their color. And here's some wonderful pictures in New York, 40,000 women walking down Fifth Avenue. This is in Baltimore in 1912. Sometimes they got a little carried away with with their dress. But it's hard, looking at these pictures, it's hard for us to imagine how difficult, how brave you had to be for a woman to march in public like this. It was considered totally inappropriate. It was considered something that no one should do, but especially not women, and especially not highborn women. And those suffragists had to be brave to even not just march, but to stand up in public or in their community and advocate for women's rights. They had to endure contempt and ridicule in their communities, their churches, their clubs, and in the press. And here you're going to see some really strong anti-suffrage images. Again, it's all about keeping women quiet. And here's another one. Pretty strong. They were pelted with rotten eggs and spoiled vegetables. In fact, Susan Anthony used to say she could mark the progress of the movement by the projectiles that were thrown at her. So when it was no longer rotten eggs and just regular old eggs, and not rotten tomatoes and just regular tomatoes, she said, that's progress. They were attacked by mobs of angry men and boys. They were denounced as radicals, perverts, traitors, anarchists, bad wives and mothers, even socialists. And here you see an anti-suffrage broadside that is aimed at the men who might be voting on a suffrage referendum. So the franchise can be granted, as you probably all know, either by the federal government or by the states. And the states are in control of election law. And so as the suffragists are working in Congress to get a federal amendment that would cover all of American women, they're also working in the individual states. And often this came to a referendum where, of course, only men could vote in the referendum, whether women deserved this. And so this was aimed at men to try to say, which do you prefer for the woman in your life? The home, you can be either a loving mother or you could be a crazy zealot on the street, and she's portrayed here, vote no on woman suffrage. They were derided as unattractive, unsexed she-men. Here you see, of course, suffragists. Why would an attractive woman want the vote? She should have a man who will vote for her. So this was how they're portrayed. Guess which one is supposedly the suffragist? And then they were going to upend the American family. This is a very potent argument, which we see echoes of today. What's going to happen when women vote? So here, mom is reading the sporting news and smoking a cigar, while dad is holding the screaming babies and is forced to make his own clothes out of her discarded skirts. This is what's going to happen when women vote. Here's another view of that. Election day, mom's going to sail out, abandon the family, and dad's left again with the screaming babies. The apocalypse is coming, and Dad's going to have to take care of the babies. And this is the threat that they saw. It was going to disrupt the American home. They weren't subtle by what they feared was going to happen. Men were going, if women wear the pants. And clearly, the suffragists were frightening. Here's my favorite, bed of trouble. I think if everyone can see this, this is kind of self-explanatory. Do we see a theme emerging here? Yeah, I think we do. In their quest for equal citizenship, the women of the suffrage movement employed a wide variety of stratagems and methods. And many of these, marches, which we've seen, demonstrations and picketing, which we're about to see, acts of civil disobedience, sophisticated lobbying and public relations operations, and the use of legal test cases to the Supreme Court to test the prohibitions against women voting, would then be adopted by the civil rights campaigns later in the 20th and in the 21st centuries. Many of these are pioneered by the suffragists. The suffragists were ingenious and fearless. They had to be. To test the prohibitions against women voting in state law, Susan Anthony and Sojourner Truth and about 150 other women actually voted in the 1872 presidential election. I have been and gone and done it, Susan wrote to her colleague Elizabeth Stanton. She voted in her precinct in Rochester. She was promptly arrested, tried, and convicted of illegal voting in a federal election. And here's a contemporary magazine cover showing her. It's called The Woman Who Dared. And she's usurped Uncle Sam's hat. She's portrayed with her threatening umbrella. She went around New York State, where she was being tried, giving a series of almost 100 lectures with the title, "Is it a crime for a US citizen to vote?" Of course, we're asking that question again today. Here's the trial transcript. It's really quite a wild trial. You should take a look at it. The judge refused to let her testify in her own defense. He dismissed the jury, took the verdict out of his pocket, and pronounced her guilty. So the failure of this voting experiment, again, there were women all around the country doing this. They prosecuted Susan Anthony because she was the face of the movement, and so that was going to get the most publicity. But the failure of this experiment in 1872 led Stanton and Anthony to draft a constitutional amendment, one that would supersede all the state laws that prohibited women voting. It was introduced into Congress in 1878, and it was stalled there for 40 years. Every year, the suffragists would go up and testify to whatever committee was hearing the bill that year. And Elizabeth Stanton said that she would give her very reasoned, very legalistic, she was really a legal thinker, arguments, and they would be ignored, and the committee chairman would be polishing his shoes, eating his lunch, clipping his nails, doing anything but listening to her. And she said she had to restrain herself from throwing her manuscript at his head. The amendment was voted down in committee or on the floor 28 times. And the suffragists, meanwhile, also pursued a long line of presidents who they hoped would give them some support. Most did not, or almost all did not, and ignored them. And here's some really interesting editorial depictions of that. Here's Elizabeth Stanton with her threatening umbrella going after Grover Cleveland. And here's another in Life magazine, and she is attacking a senator with her umbrella. It's a great cover. And then they finally had a breakthrough in 1912 when Theodore Roosevelt was running for a third, again, he was running the Progressive Party platform, which had a women's suffrage plank. And Jane Addams actually gave his nominating speech, and he supported, because he needed votes, he supported women voting. And the press had a field day with this, and here's one example. Can't win. But, so the amendment is stuck in Congress for 40 years. There's very slow progress in the states. As we know, the Western states actually give women the right to vote much sooner than the Eastern or Midwestern states. There's a lot of speculation about why that is. Why is Wyoming and Idaho and Utah and Colorado the first states to grant women the vote? And some of that is because they needed women to move to the West. And it was sort of a chamber of commerce, come to Idaho and you can have the vote. I mean, there was some idealism, and there was this sense of partnership in forging, all these new settlements. But it was also because there were only about 6 women in Wyoming. So we have to be realistic about this. But there were still very few were women states. And in the Mid-Atlantic and in New England and in the Midwest, there were many, many referenda, and very few were successful. So frustration with this congressional delay and the slow pace in the states created a rift in the American movement. Now, we see this happen in lots of social reform movements where it's going on a long time, there's frustration, a new generation emerges and says, we're going to do it a different way. And we see this happen in the labor movement. The Wobblies come up and say, okay, we're going to be more aggressive about this. It happens in the civil rights movement later in the 20th century. It happens in the gay rights movement. So it's not unusual, but it certainly happens in the American suffrage movement and in the British suffrage movement. This third generation emerges and says, we're tired of waiting. We're tired of pleading and asking and begging. We're going to demand it. We're going to be aggressive. We're going to be disruptive, and we don't care about being ladylike anymore. A young woman with a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, Alice Paul, who had, during her graduate work, joined the suffrage movement in England and learned some of their more radical techniques, brought them home to America, and said she was going to blast the American movement out of its lethargy. This is around 1913. And Alice came home, and her Women's Party did things that had never been done before. She breaks off from the mainstream group, and they picket the White House, and they picket President Wilson. Here's some great picketing signs. They had silent sentinels who stood with their picket signs at the gates of the White House in rain and in snow and in sleet and in the heat, and they would not leave. When America entered World War I in 1917, and most suffragists pledged themselves to war work, Alice Paul and her Women's Party refused to support the war effort. How can we be fighting war to make the world safe for democracy, but half of the citizens are still denied the vote? This is hypocritical. And so here you see, democracy begins at home. They did some things that were very controversial. They burned the president's words in watchfires of freedom, as they called it. They even denounced him as Kaiser Wilson. Now, this was really, really controversial. It's wartime. It's considered not only bad form, but maybe treasonous. And so there's a lot of anger about this. And the more mainstream suffragists are horrified by these tactics. Hundreds of Women's Party suffragists here in Washington were arrested on bogus charges like obstructing the sidewalk or lighting a match after sunset. Did you know that was a law? They served time in jail for their civil disobedience. They were held in the fetid Occoquan prison in Virginia and in the DC district jail. in vermin-infested cells. They were physically assaulted. They were clubbed, tied to the wall, not allowed to read or write or even speak to one another. They communicated by singing because that was not prohibited. When they refused to eat because they considered themselves political prisoners and they were given moldy food, they went on hunger strike. They were force-fed with tubes rammed down their noses. Alice Paul was held in solitary confinement for months, and to break her, the doctors threatened to commit her to St. Elizabeth's Insane Asylum. There was nothing wrong with her. They just wanted to break her leadership. When the suffrage prisoners were released, and I am wearing a pin that each suffrage prisoner was given by Alice Paul, it's sort of a badge of honor. You can get it at the Belmont Paul Museum. Hundreds of Women's Party suffragists were then released, and they went on a brilliant public relations tour. It was called the Prison Special. They're dressed in tailor-made recreations of their prison garb. They rented a Pullman car to pull them across the country on a northern route, back on a southern route. They stopped in dozens of cities and had rallies and marches and demonstrations, and they presented their case to the public and said, we are your daughters, your sisters, your mothers, and we have been tortured and imprisoned for demanding the right to vote. And here's another picture of them. And this began to really put more pressure on Congress. And so finally, after World War I, when women had contributed in ways they had never been asked to contribute before, Congress had more trouble coming up with new excuses. And so in June of 1919, we just celebrated that last June, by a very narrow vote in the Senate, I think it was 2 votes margin, the amendment was finally approved by both houses and was sent to the states for ratification. So, a year later, in the summer of 1920, the amendment is on the cusp of victory. They have 35 ratifications in the pocket, but maybe it's possibly on the cusp of defeat, because Tennessee was a very dangerous place to have to make this final stand for women's suffrage. Almost every other southern state had already rejected the 19th Amendment, including Virginia, including Maryland, all based on the same rationale of states' rights and not wanting black women to vote. The suffragists knew that they faced an uphill battle in Tennessee, but they had no choice. It was their last best hope as a state that might ratify. 9 states had already rejected. The governors of 3 other states refused to convene their legislatures. And the anti-suffragists were challenging the legality of several states who had already ratified. And these states were wending their way through the courts. Tennessee was the last chance. So all the forces for and against suffrage gathered in Nashville, and the campaign generals arrive. Carrie Chapman Catt, the president of the National Association of Women Suffrage, National American Women's Suffrage Association. She is the protege of Susan Anthony. She's the great orator, the great strategist, the great politician. She is summoned from headquarters in New York and spends 6 miserable weeks in the heat of Nashville, Tennessee, in house arrest in her hotel room because she's so controversial that they didn't want to let her out. So she stays and directs the campaign from her hotel. Also arriving that night, a young Woman's Party official, Sue Shelton White, a daughter of Tennessee, who had left Mrs. Catt's organization, left the mainstream suffragists. She's only 32 years old. She wants to be a lawyer. She's told by the sages in the courthouse that women don't become lawyers. And so she becomes a legal stenographer and has her own business as a legal stenographer, does very well. But she quits it to dedicate herself to the suffrage movement. But she joins the Women's Party because she's impatient. She wants to go to law school. She wants all those rights when she's young, not when she's old. And so Alice Paul sends her back home to Tennessee to direct the Women's Party campaign for ratification. So now we have two women's organizations, suffrage organizations, working towards the same goal, headquarters in the same hotel, but working separately, with separate staffs, separate strategies, and sometimes stepping on each other's toes. A lesson there too. Also arriving that same night in Nashville, Josephine Pearson, the president of the Tennessee Women Opposed to Women Suffrage. Yes, there were. She promised her dying mother in a very, very touching scene that she would fight the scourge of women's suffrage if it ever reached her home state of Tennessee. And she arrived from her home in the southern mountains to defend Tennessee from what she called the feminist peril. And I'll tell you, she is the most well-educated of all the women. She actually has several graduate degrees, and she is a college dean. Yeah. And they're joined there in Nashville by more than 1,000 men and women from across the state and across the nation, all staying at the Hermitage Hotel, which becomes a battlefield. And the suffrage supporters wear yellow roses, and that's why I see some of them here. The anti-suffragists wear red roses, and it's called the War of the Roses. Now, there were powerful forces working against ratification in Nashville. Political, corporate, and ideological foes, each with their own reason for opposing women getting the vote. And we don't often think of it this way. We don't think that there was this organized opposition. Politicians who feared this unpredictable new voting bloc. 27 million women would be eligible for the vote if the 19th Amendment was ratified, and no one knew how they were going to vote. And so politicians and political parties were very nervous about this and wanted to keep the status quo. Clergymen, some did support women's suffrage, many did not. Many said it was against God's plan because she had made Adam to be dominant over Eve, and to question this was totally inappropriate, and they use biblical language and biblical teaching to oppose from the pulpit and very publicly women getting the vote. Corporations who were against women's suffrage. Again, we don't think of it in this way. We think of like suffrage as a little bubble that bounces along unfettered by all the political and economic forces, but it surely was. There were a lot of corporations that believed women would be bad for business. The textile manufacturers, for instance, didn't want women voting because they feared that if women could vote, if mothers could vote, they might want to outlaw child labor. And these factories depended upon child labor. It was cheap. So it was going to be bad for their bottom line if they allowed women to vote. The liquor industry. Women had always been identified with the temperance movement. And for some, that was a moral choice about the evil of liquor. But for many others, it was a domestic violence issue because women had no rights to bring suit against an abusive husband. Divorce laws did not allow her to exit a marriage and keep the children and keep any property. So cutting the source, cutting the liquor at its source, becomes an option. And so women are identified. Not all suffragists are dries, as they call it. Some are wet. But what the liquor industry fears is that even though prohibition is in effect in the summer of 1920 and the Volstead Acts are in effect and everything should be prohibition compliant, what they're hoping, what the liquor industry is still fighting this because they're hoping that if they can keep women away from the ballot box, maybe it won't be enforced that stringently, that they won't want to put pressure on state legislatures to enforce it. And so you see the liquor lobby really pouring money. They'd always supported anti-suffrage activities, but now they're pumping money into this final campaign in Nashville. And there's some comical scenes of their, they establish a speakeasy on the 8th floor of the Hermitage Hotel. It's called the Jack Daniel's Suite, after Tennessee's favorite liquor. And they dispense liquor morning, noon, and night to any legislator who will toddle up there and listen to their reasons why he should not ratify the amendment. And so there are these amazing scenes of the legislators bouncing off the walls of the Hermitage Hotel, singing at the top of their lungs, and they have to be thrown into the showers to sober up before they go into the chamber. And Carrie Catt asks, "Is everyone in this legislature drunk?" And she's told, "Yes, that's how we make big decisions here." And Maryland, my Maryland, sends a delegation of legislators from Annapolis to Nashville to persuade the legislature there to defeat ratification. And they sit, the president of the Senate in Maryland sits with the anti-suffragists legislators there. But the most passionate foes of the 19th Amendment turned out to be women. That women might oppose the enfranchisement of their own sisters really was shocking to me when I first came across it in my research. And some of these anti-suffragists were very sophisticated, well-educated women, like Josephine Pearson, like the muckraking journalist Ida Tarbell, who had single-handedly brought down the Oil Trust and John D. Rockefeller with her articles for McClure's magazine. She was a committed anti-suffragist. She served on the board of the National Anti-Suffrage Association. And here's one that always brings gasps: Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, she's not an anti-suffragist, but she never supports the movement. And her husband is running for the vice presidency in 1920. But she's not sure how she feels about it. Her ambivalence is such that the anti-suffragists try to court her to publicly come out as an anti-suffragist. That would be a really big get for them. When New York women actually win the vote in 1917 and can vote in 1918 by referendum, she refuses to vote. Now, again, she's not a committed anti-suffragist, but she's so ambivalent. She's 35 years old, she has 5 little children, she's insecure. She doesn't know exactly what a political wife should do. But it does have a bit of a happy ending in that after ratification, she will join the League of Women Voters, become a protege of Carrie Catt, and you see her political career blossom. Now, many other of these anti-suffragists, and I think this is a fascinating aspect of the whole story, a lot of these were political, cultural, social, religious conservative women who truly feared that suffrage would bring about a profound and unhealthy shift in gender roles. And again, we hear this argument today. It would endanger the American home. We saw those cartoons, and bring about what they called the moral collapse of the nation. It would alter private life, not just public life. And that's what makes it so complicated and so dangerous. And here again is this amazing anti-suffrage broadside. It's called America When Feminized, and it shows a hen and a rooster, and the hen is wearing a Votes for Women sash. She's just walked off the nest. And the rooster calls after her, "Ma, the eggs are gonna get cold." And she calls back, "Sit on them yourself, old man. My country calls me." And one of the taglines there is, and this is directed to Southern legislators who are going to vote to ratify or not. And it says, "A vote for the federal suffrage amendment is a vote for organized, female nagging forever." I think a bumper sticker would be good. Now, this is an important reminder, I think, that the fight over women's suffrage was never just a political fight. It was also a social and a cultural and a moral debate about the role of women in society. It was a precursor to what we now call the culture wars, and that's what made it so passionate and so difficult. And lawyers are very much in this drama. All sides lawyer up, as we say these days. There is a American Constitutional League made up of lawyers who work for the anti-suffrage side, and they bring injunctions and all kinds of legal derring-do to bear to stop the 19th Amendment. And then the suffragists keep on retainer Charles Evan Hughes, former Supreme Court Justice, who writes their legal briefs to fend off the anti-suffragists. So all sides confront one another in Nashville, and it gets wild. There's bribes and booze and propaganda and blackmail, conspiracies and fistfights. The newspapers call it Suffrage Armageddon. And the outcome remains in doubt until the very last moment. And I won't spoil it for you, but it does come down to a single vote of conscience from the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, who receives a letter from his mother. Now, all this took place almost exactly a century ago, but I think you'll find the themes of this history surprising and even unnerving. It helps explain where we've been, but also where we are right now. It deals with topics that dominate our headlines: voting rights and voter suppression, citizenship rights, women's rights, dark money in politics, the role of religion in formulating public policy, and racism. Because the story of suffrage in America is inevitably a story about race. In Nashville, there were cries of white supremacy and states' rights by the anti-suffragists. The Ku Klux Klan is invoked as a dog whistle, and the Confederate flag is flown in defiance. This is the opening ceremonies for the anti-suffrage headquarters in the Hermitage Hotel. That's Josephine Pearson on your right, a national suffrage leader on your left holding the Confederate stars and bars, and the oldest Civil War veteran they could find. And there are all kinds of symbols, which I explain, that anyone in Tennessee would understand that have to do with the KKK in this photograph. Maryland did not accept the 19th Amendment and, in fact, brought suit against it. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It was not decided until 1922 in a decision written by Justice Brandeis. And I wrote this story before the 2016 election. But I have found that the story of grassroots activists fighting for their rights has taken on layers of meaning I could not have anticipated. These are, these rights that we have assumed have been secure: voting rights, women's rights, citizenship rights, press freedom, are endangered again. And I hope that the story I tell will inspire a new generation of activists to understand that protest is important and necessary, but it must be coupled with sustained and strategic political action. The suffragists did not just march and protest and picket. They also drafted legislation and campaigned and lobbied. And they didn't stop when the 19th Amendment was secure. Carrie Catt formed the League of Women Voters, and Alice Paul drafted the Equal Rights Amendment, which again, as I explained, was introduced into Congress in 1923. It has been 96 years. What happened to the 19th Amendment is also something we should recognize and learn lessons from. The 19th Amendment did give the vote to all women in every state, in every election, but it was subverted and undermined by state laws, especially in the South, the Jim Crow laws that imposed all kinds of restrictions coupled with intimidation and violence. So it would be decades until Black women could exercise their vote given to them in the 19th Amendment, just as the 15th Amendment was delayed for Black men. Asian American women and men, as well as Native American women and men, would also not be able to exercise their votes for decades. I think there are lessons to be learned from this history of women's suffrage, that political change is hard and cultural change is slow. The fight to expand our democracy is ongoing. It wasn't won in 1920. It's not over now. We still have many of these same fights to make. And it teaches us that reform movements are imperfect. The story of women's suffrage is inspiring, and it's a wonderful story that we need to know. But there are also cautionary tales embedded in it. It was messy. It was complicated. There were political and moral compromises made that should make us wince, and we need to learn from them. I think that it teaches us about the importance of voting rights. Voting rights cannot and should not be allowed to be made into a partisan issue. It is truly a stress test of our democracy. And too often, we are now failing that. There are 25 states in the last several years who have enacted onerous restrictions on voting rights, especially in minority communities. This is not the way to celebrate the centennial of our expansion, our historic expansion of voting rights. And I'm so glad that organizations like the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, the ACLU, the League of Women Voters, are in there trying to protect us from some terrible laws that have been enacted in many, many states. And it's our sacred duty to use that hard-won vote. Voter participation is not what it should be at all, especially among our young people. And I think that we need to work on that also. When Carrie Catt returned from Tennessee, she wrote a note to the women of America. And I'd like to close with that because I think it's a charge and a benediction. And if you substitute the word citizen for just woman, I think it means a lot to us today. She wrote, "The vote is the emblem of your equality, women of America, the guarantee of your liberty. That vote of yours has cost millions of dollars and the lives of thousands of women. Women have suffered agony of soul which you can never comprehend, that you and your daughters might inherit political freedom. That vote has been costly. Prize it. The vote is a power, a weapon of offense and defense, a prayer. Use it intelligently, conscientiously, prayerfully. Progress is calling to you to make no pause. Act." Thank you very much.